back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. Happy to have David Anderson returning to discuss more Rutgers football as we preview the upcoming 2024 season, just a little bit over a week away at this point. And for this episode, we wanted to discuss best case, worst case scenarios for Rutgers football in this season coming. Want to frame the schedule. We're going to go through some factors that we think will ultimately define what the results will be this season. And then we'll each give our personal best case, worst case scenarios, how we are currently thinking about this team. So just to start, obviously Rutgers has a 12-game schedule, 9-game Big Ten schedule, 3-game non-conference schedule. And David, I wanted to start just in terms of how I'm looking at the schedule. And you've talked about this concept in the past. And I'm looking at it as basically a three-part grid, three-part quadrant system in terms of how the games look to me going into the season. The first quadrant would be results that on paper seem most likely. That would be wins against Akron, Howard, and UCLA. I'm going to throw in that group for now. And then the most likely loss on the schedule is at USC on short rest at the end of October at that late night game. So I'm going to say that's one quadrant I'm looking at in terms of best case, worst case. Then, of course, that 4-game quadrant starting in mid-September at Virginia Tech, home against Washington on short rest, at Nebraska, home against Wisconsin. And then I'm looking at that month of November, the last 4 games of the season as its own quadrant in terms of Minnesota at home, at Maryland, Illinois at home, and at Michigan State. If you look at it that way, I think those games are very much up for grabs either way. That other quadrant, I think, is much harder than people maybe are giving credit for at Virginia Tech, Washington, at Nebraska, and Wisconsin. Starting off the conversation, just your initial thoughts on the schedule, if you see it framed a little bit differently, and just initial thoughts on the best case, worst case in regard to the schedule.
Overall, and thanks for having me, Aaron. Overall, I would say I generally agree with you. I mean, from my standpoint, there's USC just has a lot of talent, and we haven't seen Rutgers beat a team that has superior talent to it significantly for quite some time. Even during the Schiano 1.0, even late Schiano, like let's get 1.5 era, that was very difficult for them. So I think I definitely agree that's probably the least likely game that Rutgers will win this year. Again, there's plenty of reasons for optimism. I'm not saying this isn't them playing Michigan last year. And even then, we felt like Rutgers had a puncher's chance, and Michigan went on to be national champions. So I'm not saying it's that, but when we look at the schedule, it's hard to think that that is a game where Rutgers is going to be favored or won't have to play almost their best game to win. I agree that most of the other ones, there's so many things heading into this season that could make us think, okay, these games are more likely or less likely. I mean, their track record against Wisconsin, not great. Their track record against Maryland in recent memory, not great. Their track record against even Nebraska, winless. So, there's a lot of reasons you look at those. But then when I look at all those teams other than USC, there's a reason that you feel confident that this time's going to be different. And then there's also plenty of reasons that those teams may or may not be on a emotional high or emotional low as the season progresses. We're looking at it from the very beginning when everybody's 0-0, and a lot can change in those next few weeks. So overall, I would say I agree with you. Though, again, something like, for example, Nebraska having a true freshman quarterback playing, that could either be really, really good for them or really, really bad. And I think a lot of the other teams have similar circumstances that when they might be facing Rutgers this fall.
Excellent points. Let's get into the factors that we think ultimately will help define the results of the season. Obvious one, quarterback play. Ethan Kaliakmanis, we've gone on about it quite a bit just in terms of accuracy being the biggest priority, in terms of also the most realistic way to improve as with quarterback play based on Wimsatt's accuracy percentage last year, being in the low 50s, high 40s. Kaliakmanis with a chance here to come in around 60%, maybe higher. We'll see. But just the importance of being able to complete passes earlier downs, short yardage situations, not putting them in a hole in 3rd and long like they were so many times in the past. Overall, I guess, what are your concerns and what are your thoughts in terms of where quarterback play can help this team or ultimately hurt this team in 2024?
Well, I think if something was to go absolutely horribly wrong in an absolute worst case scenario, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I'm saying hypothetically, in the worst case scenario, you have to assume that quarterback struggles, quarterback play would have to be in there, whether it be either injuries or turnovers, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the quantity of turnovers. It could just be the timing of them. I mean, when we look back at last year, the Wisconsin game and the Ohio State game, and I think you could even say the Michigan game. I mean, all three of those games, it wasn't the number of turnovers. It was they came at the worst possible time for Rutgers in those games to have a chance to pull an upset. And so, yeah, do I think that the luck is that bad for it to happen exactly that way again? No, but you have to assume that, yeah, untimely plays like that could be and one of the undoings of this team. But again, because I think that you roll the dice like that last year, it doesn't seem likely that you're going to roll the dice and it happen exactly that way again, unless you just have so many more turnovers because of fumbles, bad field conditions. Maybe you have to put in your backup quarterback for some reason in an odd circumstance and he's not ready. Like there's so many different things. Maybe there's some weird headset communication thing now that they're in there for 15 seconds and the coach is talking, he's mid sentence and something happens. Like there can be kind of odd things that happen, and that may or may not be the difference in a game. So again, I think, do I think that we'll have worse quarterback play than last year? No. So I think that if we have equal quarterback play, as long as you avoid absolutely drive killing or game changing turnovers, that I don't think that would be a reason that Rutgers falls apart. But if they were to fall apart over the course of the season, you'd have to expect that would be one of, if not the most likely reason for it.
Yeah, great points. And I think, the half glass full side, it's a big reason why people are so optimistic because you have to imagine quarterback play will be better than last year. The bar is really low. And if Kaliakmanis can improve on his own play from last year, take a step forward, maybe 2 steps, maybe 3, this offense, if they could just be average, the ceiling for this team overall goes up quite a bit. So it's not like the hurdles that have to be passed for this offense to go up and give this team a better chance week in and week out. It's not such a high hurdle to cross. Is just pretty realistic. So going to offensive line, obviously tied to quarterback, big part of the offensive course. The offensive line making strides last year. Shiano saying after the first scrimmage recently that essentially the starters are set. Leads us to believe that obviously you have Holland Pierce. We knew the left side was set with Holland Pierce at left tackle, Brian Felter at left guard, Gus Zelinkis back at center. But based on those comments, we think that means probably Kobe Osamora will start again at right guard, and then Tyler Needham back from injury after starting the year before and then suffering that injury against Temple. Seems to be in line as the starter at right tackle. That leaves just some depth pieces with Reggie Sutton and also the transfer Shredrick Rhodes that could potentially play either guard or tackle position. Sutton obviously has in his career, and so has Rhodes at Ohio. That being said, what are your thoughts on the offensive line? What could go wrong in your sense in terms of how that could impact results? And what do you kind of expect from this group going into the season?
Yeah, I mean, it's a natural thought exercise to think that the thing that can doom any team more than anything else is bad offensive line play. And one of the offsetting factors is often you hear it said that it's very rare for a team with a good offensive line to be bad. It's possible for a team with a bad offensive line to be good, but it's really, really hard for a team with a good offensive line to be bad. And so the question is, how good is this offensive line? I think that Rutgers, the one piece that scares me would be Holland Pierce being a potential, single point of failure in a sense, because the other guys, I mean, I love Zelinskis. I think Felter can do a lot of things, but there's reasons that they're not, in their 4th year starting. And some of those guys that they were in position battles with over the course of that time period are still on the roster. So there's reason to believe that Rutgers, though they would love to have more depth, it doesn't seem like this is the the all or nothing that we may have had in years past, or even the kind of thing where you often see with a group of 5 team where they really only have 5 guys who can play. Same thing like you would see in basketball where a team only has like 5 guys who they can put in. And so if anything happens to any one of those guys, they're in trouble. I don't think we're in that state of affairs. The other thing I would say in tandem with just offensive line play is another year under the Kirk Soroka system. Is there certain things on tape? And the main one I would point out would be Reggie Sutton uh, really struggled last year in pass protection. If you look at the numbers, any advanced statistics, even the eye test, and he somehow made it work. If has to play, again, we don't think he has to be a starter right now, but you got to assume he's going to have to play at some point. Our team's going to be just going straight at him for that reason. I mean, Michigan State tried it, and ultimately Rutgers still held on in that game because of sheer willpower. So I feel good about it, but there are definitely always going to be reasons that an offensive line could sink a team. I feel like Rutgers has protected themselves pretty well this year, but you would always assume if everything goes horribly wrong, that's going to be one reason. I mean, if we look back at Chiano 2010 season, that's the biggest thing that sunk that ship. And we thought that their offensive line had been building and building and building for a decade at that point. So, I mean, for me, yes, I don't have zero level of concern, but I do think there's plenty of mitigating factors with that position as to why it won't be. Your thoughts?
Yeah, great points. I mean, listen, we're Rutgers fans. How could you not ever be concerned going into the season with quarterback play and offensive line play? It just comes with the territory. Obviously, reasons to be hopeful for both. I think the stability at offensive line, and obviously Coach Pat Flaherty flats back, and the wonders he kind of did last year. Now having another full off season with this group, and having that stability back, I think is a really good sign and gives confidence that they're going to be even better. We know Kyle Monungai, I mean, constantly facing, it's all related, right? I mean, those 8-man fronts he faced last year, if Kyle McManus could be more accurate, if he can complete some short yardage passes earlier in downs, the offensive line's job is going to be a little bit easier because probably the box isn't going to be stacked as much, which leads to a better run game, hopefully. And obviously, we have Sam Brown. We're hoping to be a able number 2 now, full year off the injury. So there's just, if you put that all in a box together, there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. But as you said, I mean, it could fall apart at any minute with an injury or some type of regression in some way. Maybe teams are scouting them differently. Who knows? You're obviously facing different opponents as well. But I think their ability to move the chains with the run game, obviously with the running backs, but the offensive line, but they were able to do that. And then, they allowed very few sacks last year. Obviously, Wimsett is more mobile than Cali McManus. I know we've argued that Cali McManus is more mobile than people think, but that's going to be a key development too, just in terms of keeping him clean in the pocket and avoiding that type of thing where they're allowing 3-4 sacks a game, which they were able to avoid last year. That's going to be obviously key as well, just in terms of the rhythm of the offense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more likely that the passing threat will help the offensive line, which is, again, I mean, the real mitigating factor here. The other thing I would say is, Rutgers, they should be able to keep defensive secondaries and linebackers back a little bit more for fear that those dump offs are going to go for big yardage. I mean, Ethan Kaliakmanis, if he showed us one thing last year that is just infinitely better than what Gavin Wimsett was able to do, it's that if it's 2nd and 10, you surprise them with a pass play because they're thinking run, and then the defense does that type of technique I talk about all the time. It's like a oversimplification, but where they're kind of like playing run, and then they're like, oh, there's a pass, and then they start bailing. That's a time when if you hit a back, especially maybe even a tight end on a check down, they're running forward and the defense is kind of like backpedaling, or they have to readjust their feet. And just those plays alone should give Rutgers the ability to get back on schedule and offset some of those. Like, even if the box is technically 8 guys, the defense will have to be more ready to bail their assignment in the run game. And that sets you up for angles to attack. And Kalik Manis has been pretty good at hitting those throws. So, yeah, there's a lot of like little things like that where I feel like Rutgers is positioning themselves to be less quarterback dependent.
Yeah, great points there. Let's go over to defense, just in terms of obviously high hopes for the defense to take another step this season. So many starters back. Obviously, it was a top 20 defense in terms of total yardage last year. Struggled down the stretch, but obviously that schedule had a lot to do with it. Some injuries there as well. What are your thoughts in terms of concern or outlook as well for this defense in terms of defensive line? You welcome Malcolm Ray, the transfer from Florida State. You have Wesley Bailey back healthy after playing through injury last year. Linebacker, a little bit of instability right now with Motoray and Tyrone Powell. And then obviously your secondary's back for the most part, other than Max Melton now in the NFL. Eric Rogers stepping up for Max Melton alongside Robert Longerbeam and having all three safeties back, Nick Benusin, Loyal, and Dixon. Overall, what are you looking at for the defense perspective in terms of ceiling and floor and how that will help dictate results for this season?
Well, the number two thing that can sink any team is just not being able to stop the run up the middle. We talked about this at length, especially with the Northwestern game in the season opener last year. But I feel as optimistic about the interior Rutgers run defense probably at any time in recent memory. And that's saying a lot because they've had some good run defenses. Maybe some run defenses that like wore out because of overexposure, but they've had guys in that spot. And this year's no different. Even if you talk about having to play, for example, Moses Walker and Dariel Jabomi, as they're getting a lot of reps right now, both of them are scoring quite well, whether it be regular metrics of tackling or even advanced metrics or even pro football focus type thing. So I feel like the linebackers are going to be solid against the run. And then the interior guys, even at defensive end with someone like Jordan Thompson, did a great job against the run. So in general, even though that can normally be the number two reason a team would just implode over the course of a season, I feel as though Rutgers has done plenty for their floor to just be so high in that area that I'm not overly concerned. But on the other half of the equation on defense is the pass defense. And the real reason that I think we need Tyrone Powell to come back is because from a coverage standpoint, Walker in his limited snaps, Jabomi, who is getting better in this area, but neither of them have been great in coverage. And then to offset that, Rutgers needs one of three things to happen. Their cover men to be so elite that it doesn't matter, their linebackers to improve in pass coverage, or the pass rush of the front four to really be getting home. And so I feel like there's enough lottery tickets that this isn't going to sink the season, but you do need to see more from all three levels to potentially make you feel good going to bed at night that, hey, this isn't going to be one of the things that prevents us from having the season that we want to have.
Good stuff is always there. And now, of course, the third unit, which sometimes people don't give enough credit for, but obviously being at Rutgers, Greg Schiano, special teams, such a vital part to the success of Rutgers football. What are you thinking there in terms of concerns and just how they could impact the results in both a positive and or negative way this season?
I mean, I think Jay Patel is pretty solid at kicker. And then even when we saw like a worst case scenario, like I talked about with that year where Rutgers had to basically take Nick Borghese out of like the student population generally to kick. I mean, that it didn't totally sink the season, but I feel like from a kicking standpoint, even if Patel was to like miss a game or two because he, is under the weather, like that's not going to implode the season. We know in the return games, Rutgers hasn't done much. They have been, a team that blocks a lot of kicks that did help win a couple games last year, but I don't think that necessarily is going to be what derails the year. That might make it going from good to great or special. But the one area on special teams that you have to just always focus on is the punt game, because one of the reasons Rutgers has had the success even 2-3 years ago when they weren't, 500, but they won a couple Big Ten games, is because they had an elite punting unit. And Greg Schiano himself said punt is the most important play in the sport of football. So having someone who wasn't around for spring camp and is in their first collegiate action, that has to be a concern. That let's say something happens to him, I know they've got some other walk-ons. There's always more than one guy that practices punting. But as I explained in several previous podcasts, like I was able to learn how to kick fairly easily, having played soccer, like place kick. But in terms of punting, so much goes into just dropping the ball and striking it reliably every time. You can't just expect that a backup punter is going to be able to do that. Even catching the ball, like we saw Michigan State struggle with last year. So that has to be a concern. Again, I think Rutgers has a good enough track record that we need to trust the coaching staff and they'll make something work. But yeah, I mean, we've had times where Mohamed Sanu had to come in and punt. Sansenti, Jeremy Ito, who weren't elite punters, had to punt. There was even the time Garif Glashen, a defensive back, had to be a punter under an odd circumstance. So you always fear, especially as a Rutgers fan, for the worst, that if that isn't at least average, we're not going to see the same level of success that we all hope coming off of, like, let's say 1 year of average and 4 years of elite punting prior to it. I guess 5, because I think Corsack played 5 years plus the Ryan Anderson year. So to me, that's the only unit on special teams that really, I would say, okay, in a worst case scenario, what happened? But also, I don't think that Rutgers is like gonna lose a bunch of games because of their punter. But a game here and there that they need to win or could go either way, sure, that might be a factor.
Yeah, very true. Obviously, bringing Jacob Anderson in now, they felt it was a move they needed to make. Comes from Australian that style, and Corsack has worked for them in the past, so you got to like that aspect of it. But Rutgers did take a step back last season, so that's an area they need to improve on. Hopefully, Jacob Anderson is an improvement. But of course, last season too, I think from my perspective, just the 3 blocked kicks that they returned for touchdowns. Each time they did that, they won the game. Obviously, wasn't the only factor in those wins, but when traditionally in the Shiano era, both first tenure and second, when they block a kick and return it for a touchdown, it just makes Rutgers that much harder to beat. Another thing that last year happened is they didn't really get a lot from the return teams in terms of return yardage. So that's an area I think will be interesting to watch. Is Christian Dremel going to ascend as that punt returner? We'll see what happens on kick returns. But if Rutgers get anything out of the return game this year, they haven't gotten that last year after years of Aaron Cruikshank and Janarian Grant before him and having these great returners. There's got to be some hope that maybe they can turn that around for this season, and that would be a big bonus. But overall, you can't, special teams for Rutgers has won them games in the past, but you certainly can't have a unit that loses you games. And punting is obviously a big part of that. So going through those 4 factors, obviously quarterback play, offensive line play, defensive coverage in the pass game, and then special teams with a punt unit. Those are really, I think, 4 factors that jump out to us. Let's go back now and look at that framework of the schedule and give our individual best case, worst case scenario. Again, this is not a season prediction. We're not going to pin down a record, but just in terms of what we think the ceiling and the floor for this team can be in terms of a best case and worst case scenario. David, why don't you start just in terms of best case, worst case for floor for this team?
Best case, worst case, wins and losses. All right, I would say the best case would be 10-2 because, like I say, you always have a clunker in there. I would say worst case could be. I mean, this is a big stretch. Worst case could be as low as 5-7. I mean, really, if we're talking about what's realistic, I think this team will go something between 7-5 and probably 8-4, 9-3 max. I mean, I would say that's probably where I'm looking at over these next few weeks as we have to pencil in where we think they're going to be. But there's just so many games on the schedule that could go either way. I'm having trouble figuring out what I think is the second hardest game they might even have. I mean, going into the season, it might be Maryland because of how much they've struggled against the Terrapins, and it's on the road. But at the same time, it's like Maryland has to face a gauntlet similar to what Rutgers did last year. Their final 4 games are at Oregon, versus Rutgers, versus Iowa, and then at Penn State. So, I mean, Maryland may be in the same place that Rutgers was last year, and if they're not 6-2 heading into that final stretch, then there might be some turmoil down in College Park. On the flip side, we might know if Maryland's not hot in September that like things are bad. So that's a total wild card. In terms of Wisconsin, Rutgers hasn't beaten them. I think it would be remiss not to mention this every single time it comes up. The Rutgers has a 6 consecutive game stretch where they face teams they have never beaten. Now, we know they haven't played UCLA and USC, but to think that you're going to go and win all 6 of those games, I mean, a greatest season of all time, yeah, you do. But you have to assume that that's a lot of uncharted territory to break in the meat of the season. So I think that you'll be happy to come out of that stretch going 4-2, maybe even 3-3 in those 6 games, which would set you up for a good, albeit if you want to have an elite all-time great season, you're going to have to go 5-1 in those games, probably, maybe even 6-0. So that's kind of where I see it. But then you could make a case that like any of these teams, Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan State, Virginia Tech, Washington, any of those teams could end up being the best team that Rutgers faces all season. I don't really think it's going to be Minnesota and Nebraska, but it's possible looking at how things break down. And so there's just a wide range of outcomes for this upcoming season. But I do think, yeah, Rutgers could win double-digit games. I don't want to be on the record saying that they can't and then being told that I told you so. But for my money, I do think that we're looking at the normal, maybe 1 or 2 more wins than the previous year, which is more par for the course in the end of the college football season when you look at how a program evolves over time. I know I give a huge range there. I tried to narrow it down to be more realistic, but where do you fall in that spectrum?
Yeah, that was great. Similar, but a little bit different. I'm going to go a little bit more of a higher ceiling, but also a little bit more of a lower floor, if that makes sense. I think that there is a world I could see Rutgers going 11-1. Again, that's a very, very small chance. A lot has to go right. I think you're right. There's always a clunker. Obviously, road games at USC, at Nebraska, at Maryland, at Virginia Tech. That's 4 really tough road games. And to think that Rutgers can win 3 of them is about as optimistic as you could be. I think winning all 4 is unrealistic, but I do think that there is a world, like you said, with Maryland. Maybe they're pretty, kind of spiraling downward at that point in November. I think that USC is not likely at all, but stranger things have happened. Nebraska is a game earlier in the season that's going to be really I think a ceiling defining game for Rutgers and kind of a statement opportunity for them. And it's all going to depend about the momentum going into that game. You will have an extra day rest. And then, of course, it all starts at Virginia Tech for a very, very highly anticipated but very difficult game for both teams. Both kind of very trendy national sleepers right now to make some noise and even, getting consideration for the college football playoff. I had Jake Budd on recently, and he talked about the issue with Rutgers is that, if they are 10-2, they probably won't have a lot of ranked wins. We do know that
Right.
USC is a preseason ranked team, but that is probably their most likely loss as well. So I just think that 4-game stretch of at Virginia Tech, Washington at home on short rest, and then you're at Nebraska and then Wisconsin home, as you mentioned. Other than Virginia Tech, they haven't beaten those teams. I think that's a harder 4-game stretch than people are giving it credit. I think, if you look at just historically the brands of those programs, much higher profile than Rutgers. That doesn't necessarily play out on the field, but I think that is saying something that in most years we look at that 4-game stretch and say, hey, if they can go 2-2, that's pretty impressive. I think 2-2 would be what you want to get out of that, worst case. But it's as a worst case scenario, I think they could lose all 4 of those games, to be honest with you. Obviously,
True.
injuries is a factor with all of this. And that's why when I get into November, I mean, that is a feast or famine stretch, I think, where I could see them running the table and winning all 4 of those games. But if they get to that point and they're really beat up and they're just, things are a mess offensively, those are all games they could lose too. So I think the floor is actually 4-8. I think that I could see that happening. Unfortunately, I have nightmares about that scenario. I don't think it's likely. I think they'll be better than that, but I could see a world in which things really fall apart. And I think injuries would be a major factor in all of that, where they do ultimately go 4-8. But I do see a ceiling of 11-1. I think the most realistic scenario, which to counter off of what you said, which was a really good point in terms of kind of where you see it actually falling. I think the most realistic scenario is being 5-3 after that USC game going into November with 4 winnable 50-50, maybe better than 50-50 games. Going back to wrap up just in terms of being favored, right? Those 4-game quadrant of at Virginia Tech with Washington at home, at Nebraska, and then Wisconsin at home. I could see them being underdogs in 3 of those 4 games, where in November, they could end up being favorites in all 4 of those games, depending on how the season's playing out. So I'm optimistic on the close as opposed to last year. I'm very nervous and concerned about that 4-game stretch mid-September to mid-October. It's going to be obviously a momentum thing as well. If they can get that, I just think if they can get through that, if they can get through that stretch 3-1, yeah, I think that 10-2 is doable. But if you get through that 2-2, you still have USC on the table. You still have a lot of matchup games in November. It's going to be really hard to reach your ceiling. But I think yes, realistically, 8-4, 7 anywhere from 7-5 to 9-3. I think is probably most likely where I would say the season's going to fall, and a lot of contributing factors. And we know football is a game of inches. We know how close they were last year to losing that Michigan State game. So momentum is going to be key here, which is why I'm optimistic with November. I think if they could get in there relatively healthy, have a winning record going into November, they really can, maybe not reach their ceiling per se of what we're talking about, but they could have a really good season and make notable strides forward in the win column.
Yeah, I mean, I think this season can break a lot of different ways for all the teams. But even when you look at, for example, like Illinois, not great, but they played their best game of the year last year, probably against Maryland. They have this Rutgers-ish stretch of Penn State, Purdue, Michigan, Oregon in a 4-week span. I mean, that I do not want that schedule.
No.
And then that's 3 top 10 teams in a 4-week period, basically. But then even Illinois, they get a breather in the sense of they get Minnesota, a bye week, then they play Michigan State, who more on them in a second, and then Rutgers. So you got to assume that Illinois, after that gauntlet like Rutgers has faced in the past, they might be swinging up. And sometimes what happens when a team faces that type of adversity is they do separate their men from the boys, and they find something that might work at the end of the season. So I don't think there's any gimmies on this schedule. I really do think they'll be Akron. I just think the team is too strong this year. But after that, like, there's reason for optimism and pessimism in pretty much every game. Like Virginia Tech, one thing I also often say from readers, especially that used to read us a lot at our previous stop, was if you have played a real team before somebody else, that gives you a huge advantage. And Virginia Tech is facing Vanderbilt, who is not one of the stronger SEC teams, but they're facing them in week 1. And so Rutgers will not have by far going to be their toughest game, where you don't really know. Maybe they'll have played Vanderbilt and learned a lot of things about their team that way. But then Rutgers does have the mitigating reverse of that. Yeah, it's a road game, but Rutgers has a bye week. Would you rather have a bye week, or would you rather have played a more elite team heading into it? So prior, and it's not the week before, it's just prior. So there's a lot of weirdness in the schedule with how that could go. I mean, I already mentioned how Maryland's season closes out basically pretty much the exact same as Rutgers' end of the year last year as well. And then the one note I'll say about Michigan State is, like, that's the type of team you probably would want to play in the middle of the year, because you have to assume they're going to be better at the end than the beginning. With new coaching staffs at Washington and Michigan State, it'll be interesting to see that they get Washington in the middle of the year, Michigan State at the end. I'm hoping that Michigan State, will be both talent depleted as well as kind of just at the end of your first year with a new coach. Sometimes they're just exhausted because there's like all this excitement in the preseason. You kind of, expend a little bit of that extra energy early on, and then it's just a grind by the end when you're in the dog days. But for a team that had such a tough year last year on and off the field, like, they might be energized to face Rutgers as well. So that's why I think it's more likely that it's going to be closer to like true toss-up games this year for a majority of the schedule, because there's so many reasons to, believe that Rutgers should be favored, or even if they're favored, but the other team has some other like advantages in there, or vice versa, that momentum could be a bigger factor than we've ever seen before. But at the same time, both teams are going to be, every week's going to be a roll of the dice about how they did the week prior. And so that's what's going to make this really, really exciting, but also a reason why Rutgers may not hit their ceiling. This isn't like basketball where you get a 4-game stretch of toss-ups and two of the games you hit a couple 3-pointers. Like football, that, one thing could go wrong this week, a different thing could go wrong next week, or the reverse. One thing could go right this week. Next week, I don't know, Ben Black or like somebody just plays their first game of the season and scores like 4 touchdowns, and the defenses haven't seen them, kind of like, Tim Brown when he was a freshman. Like things like that can happen. That's what happened in that 2006 season, why it was so magical. 1 week's Kenny Britt coming out of nowhere. 1 week is a certain defensive back has a great year out of nowhere. Like he has his moment. Like, and so to have that ceiling, you're going to have different contributions each week for it to work, but the reverse is also possible as well. And so again, I'm optimistic overall. And just even if they were to go 7-5, don't panic about this season. The arrow is still pointed up. You know, there's definitely a foundation in place for this program at this point. And I think I don't necessarily think in college football you are what your record says you are, but I think we're getting a little bit too far away from that these days to think that a team that goes 10-2 is really not that good, and a team that goes 5-7 actually is good, but they just had bad luck. It does even out over the course of a season, and so I'm really excited as we're heading into the season opener, and it's going to be a wild ride once we kick off that first game against Howard.
Yeah, very well said as always. And yeah, it's going to be really an interesting ride. And you're right. Week to week, the outlook could change. And, you know, it's a lot more fun and it's easier to look at the schedule and say, oh, they could win all those games. But I just think, as we pointed out, for those reasons and those possible factors, this could change pretty quickly. And, you know, you and I have both said in the past, they could go 6-6 again and be a better team than last year. It doesn't mean that they took a step back as a team, but a lot has to go right. And there's a lot of teams that on the schedule today will be better than we're thinking right now. So I always go back to how many games do we think they're going to be favored? I don't think they're going to be favored for 10 games this season. I think it's more likely 6 or 7. And obviously that could change as the momentum goes and if they can start well. But yeah, there's a ton of factors. But the bottom line is reasons for optimism exist. We see a higher ceiling than we've seen in years and ever being in the Big Ten. So that's saying something in terms of obviously the floor is the floor. You know, there's no guarantees. They, of course, could still have a losing season if a lot of things go wrong. We don't think all those things are going to go wrong. We both see a winning season, but there's different degrees of where this could go. But once again, David, thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much for everyone listening and watching. We're getting pumped up here. Season not too far away. And I hope you enjoyed this episode as part of our season preview. Thanks so much for listening to the Scarlet Faithful podcast once again.